So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Wednesday, the last day of September. Tomorrow it's October, but October is a good month. The leaves turn yellow. We get Halloween. What's that? PlayStation 5 is coming out. If that's a important thing. What's the date?
I think 24th.
That's still a long wait. That's a good 3 weeks. Oh well, you'll make it. You'll make it. If only there was another video game console that you could play in the meantime, right? Okay, so let's see who's here. So Kenan's here. Good morning to you. Daniel's here. Hola. Shamimu's here. Good morning to you. Well, good evening to you, I guess. Shamimu. Daniel's here. Hello, Daniel. Vicky's here. Hello, Vicky. Jarek is here. Good morning, Jarek. Jarek was in my history and social justice class a couple of terms ago, and so I guess he's crashing the party. So, hey, Jarek, nice to see you. Clara's here. Good morning, Clara. And I think that's Zion. Good morning, Zion. Okay, so yesterday, how'd the quiz go? Easy, hard, medium?
Did you finish marking it?
Almost. I'll give them back to you tomorrow. I'm almost there. How did it go? Okay? Not okay? Hello. Well, I guess we'll find out for sure tomorrow. All right. So before we did the quiz on. So I guess it was Monday, right? So on Monday we were talking about privilege, right? And so I said that one of the ways that okay, hang on. Let me restart. We said that oppression was something that occurred over society as a whole, right? So nobody was really doing anything in order to make oppression happen. Oppression was based on the way that society was created. It was kind of baked into social norms and policies and laws and just kind of ways of doing things. Oppression kind of serves to advantage one group and disadvantage another. And nobody has to do anything kind of specific to make that happen. It's just the way that the machine of society operates, right? But we were trying to sort of get a better understanding of what this privilege thing was, because some people have a difficult time understanding it. Some people think that it doesn't exist. Bad news, it does exist. Sorry. It does exist. And so I wanted to make sure that we understood what it was. And so we read 2 articles. We read one article, and then I decided that it wasn't very good, so we read a different one, and I made you read 2 like a jerk. But I made you read 2 articles, and then I asked you these questions. And so what does having privilege mean to you?
Having earning advantages that is restricted to a certain group of people.
Right. So a certain group of people in society that have advantages or opportunities that other people don't necessarily have, right? So how does that benefit people with privilege? Yeah, George.
Sometimes it helps them get jobs easier, get paid more, and probably people will be biased to them to more like be nicer towards like some certain race than other races.
Right. So we've definitely seen how privilege can get you a job, right? We saw in that resume hiring situation where names that were stereotypically white sounding had much more likelihood to be called back, right? And so that will help you if you're trying to get a job, right? It shouldn't, right? It shouldn't help you, but the data suggests that it does, right? Do you think people who are better looking get treated better in society?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you think that pretty girls and hot guys get like more free stuff and they get treated better? Yeah. Yeah, they do, right? Because we don't normally talk about it in terms of social equality, right? We usually talk about race and sex and gender and things like that. But there is a hotness privilege as well, right? And people who are good looking tend to get treated nicer and they get more free things and people want to hire them or include them in things, right? And again, I'm not saying that that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that that's an advantage that people who are good looking tend to get.
Can you describe free things?
Could I describe what?
Free things.
Free, I'm thinking more like
Deals?
deals and things like that, right? People would want to do favors for you more if you were good looking than if you were not, right? How does it negatively affect people in minoritized groups?
They get left out of groups or something.
They'll get ignored more.
They might get ignored, they might get left out of groups. Similarly, they might be less likely to be hired for a job, right, which is a big thing. Everybody needs a job, everybody needs to be able to work. It shouldn't be more difficult for you to get a job just because of your name or your race or your gender. That's why we made it illegal, but it still happens anyway. We'll have a few more answers to this number 2 after I give you a little bit more information. But I did ask you kind of an important thing. So are those who have privilege doing something wrong necessarily? Because I said that I have it, right? I'm a white male in Canada. I'm a Canadian citizen. I've got tons of privilege. Am I doing something wrong?
No, it's not. Yeah, it's not something that you can control.
Right.
And if you use it to make good social norms, then it's not.
Right. Me having my privilege is not necessarily a good thing, right? We don't want to have some people unfairly advantaged, but it's not my fault either, right? I didn't choose my race or my gender or my nationality or where I was born. I didn't choose any of that stuff. And so I kind of just am who I am in many ways by accident, right? But that doesn't mean that I am off the hook, right? It doesn't mean that I am, I can say, well, I have privilege and you don't, so tough, right? That's not what I can say, right? I have to use my privilege in order to sort of help rectify those inequalities in society. And so arguably, that's what I'm doing right now, right? I'm using my privilege to tell people that, yeah, there is racism in Canada and we need to address it, right? Yes, we have sexism in Canada, right? Women and men are not on equal footing in this country, and that cannot be, right? We need to fix that. Never mind other genders, but we'll get to that when we talk about sexuality. So yeah, people with privilege aren't necessarily doing anything wrong, but it is up to them to recognize that they have it and know how it works and know how to use it for the benefit of others, right? That's the trick to this. And I think that's why some people reject the idea of having privilege because they think it means they're doing something wrong, right? They feel guilty about it. They feel like, oh, I have privilege, so I must be an awful person and a racist, so I don't have privilege. And it's like, no, that's not how it works. And there is no way to give up your privilege. You can't turn it off, right? Because it has to do with the way society works and just your social identity. So I can't not be white, right? That's ridiculous to say, but I can't not be. So again, the only choice I have is to recognize my privilege, know how it operates, work to reduce inequality in society, and work to educate others about what it is and how it works. That's kind of all I can do.
Is it okay if black companies are doing anything about it? Will that make you bad?
Well, it's certainly your choice, right? And actually, that's a good point, Avera, because part of what privilege is people with privilege can ignore the fact that they have it, right? So if we took racism, for instance, we live in a society, in Canadian society has racism. There is racism here, but again, is it directed at me? Am I the victim of racism? No, right? As a white person, I am not a victim of racism. So can I ignore it? I guess I could, right? It's not going to change my life because racism isn't isn't directed at me. So yeah, I can just go on with my life and ignore racism and just whatever, right? That's part of privilege. But if you are, say, if you are black, if you are Indian, if you are Asian, if you are, I know this isn't race, but if you are Muslim, for instance, ignoring racism is much more difficult, right? Because it's pointed at you, you can feel it. And so you can try to ignore it, but it's much more difficult in that case. Whereas for me, it's much easier to ignore because it's not pointed at me. So I can do it, right? If I decide that, this is too much for me, we've got Trump in the White House down there, there's a coronavirus, there's forest fires, I don't have the bandwidth for this racism thing, I'm just going to ignore it. I mean, that's your choice. You can do that. But if you want to be someone who's working towards social equality, you can use your privilege to kind of help people speak up, to make space for minoritized people to speak, and to educate others. So you can do that. And it doesn't take, you don't have to volunteer all your free time and start a foundation. You don't have to do that. It can be very simply done. So you don't have to take on, this huge thing. It can be very simple. But part of privilege is that you get to, you can ignore it. You can just go on with your life and it probably won't come up for you, right? But again, if you're in a minoritized group, much more difficult to ignore. And yeah, so the last thing I asked you was, can you think of ways that you have privilege? And I kind of wanted to, sorry, I'm just going to call up this this article because I want to look at it while I'm saying this. I wanted you to think about all of those points that Peggy McIntosh made, because she had like 40 or 50 of them in her article, and those are privileges she has. And so I gave you a couple of examples of privilege that I had and experiences that I had that showed it, right? So I said when I was younger, I got stared at when I was in the convenience store all the time because people thought I was going to steal from the store, which sometimes teenagers do, right? And so I was, I didn't really have the privilege of age in that situation. But of course now I'm an old guy, not that old, but when I go into a convenience store, nobody looks at me at all, right? I can just walk up the aisles and nobody's staring at me, waiting for me to steal something. And then I told you that story about when I was in Russia and that girl checked me out. And I said that, that was kind of a fun experience for me, but it also made me think about women who are often subjected to that kind of attention very frequently every day, right? And of course, the more attractive you are, the more attention you're going to get from men. And sometimes that might be exhausting, right? Sometimes it might make you feel self-conscious or uncomfortable or, feeling like you always have to be on guard. Or sometimes it might actually make you feel frightened or unsafe, depending on the situation that you're in and the person who is, paying attention to you in that way. And so that sort of clued me into the idea that, oh, I have this privilege where I can just walk through the world. I don't have to worry about anyone really staring at me. I don't usually feel unsafe, particularly around guys, unless they're like really scary or drunk or high or something. Sometimes I'm like, okay, this is a bad situation, but for the most part, I don't have to feel that. I can just walk through my life and not have that feeling, not be on guard. But for women, it's not that way, right? Women have to be much more cautious of their surroundings. They have to fend off advances from men sometimes. They might have to feel uncomfortable or frightened. I shouldn't say they might have to. They might feel uncomfortable. But again, that's not something I have to deal with. And again, that's not fair. That's not the way it should be. But I saw a way in which I was privileged that I was not really aware of prior to that. Just give me a couple examples if you can remember. What what ways are you privileged? Either here or maybe in your home country is easier to think of. George? To be able to go to school, right? So depending on where you go to school, and what country you're in, your family upbringing and also your finances may determine whether or not you're able to get an education, right? And so people with more stable families of origin, people with more money have better access to education, and people who don't have those things, not so much, right? And actually, we're kind of seeing that in Vancouver right now because students have had to go back to school with COVID, right? But families who have more money can afford to have their children educated privately. And so they don't have to expose their children to a potentially dangerous virus. Now, whether that will make a difference in the long run is hard to know, but I think we can agree that there is a privilege aspect there, right? Those parents with money can protect their children from the virus and also continue to educate them. Whereas, if public school shuts down, I don't think it will, but if it were to shut down, all of those regular students from middle class or lower class families, they might not have an education for a while. But wealthy families can afford to protect their children and also continue their education. They have some privilege in that regard. What else? What else did we say? Ways in which you are privileged as a man, as a member of your race, as a member of your sexuality or religious group or citizenship. Where do you have advantage and privilege where others do not? What's that? Free rights? Yeah, so at home or here or both? Anywhere in the world? Yeah, so if you live in a country that respects human rights, then that's kind of a privilege that you enjoy, right? If you're a member of that country, then you enjoy that privilege, right? I live in a country where, our rights are enshrined in the Constitution, and for the most part, we respect them. And so that's a privilege I have. I don't have to worry about losing my individual human rights in my country. But of course, that's not the case for everybody around the world. Some people live in countries where their individual rights are not as well protected. What else? What else? If you were to, let's say you live in a country where homosexuality is illegal, okay? Harsh punishments for homosexuality. And let's further say that you are a gay person, okay? Now, you don't have the same privilege as heterosexual people in that country, right? Because heterosexual people can go out there, they can find themselves a partner, whether they find them or whether it's an arranged marriage or whatever. You can walk through the streets with your partner. Maybe you can kiss them or hold their hand or whatever, depending on social norms of the area. But as a gay person, you don't have any of those privileges, right? You are not allowed to do that, and doing that can result in pretty significant legal punishments, right? So you're discriminated against as a homosexual person, and you don't even have the privilege of being able to sort of walk down the street with your partner and give them a little kiss on the cheek. Right? You can't do that. Let me just look through this list and see if there's anything else I wanted to. One of the things that came up here for me, or one of the things I wanted to point out to you, is that which one was it? Oh. Do you think, let's use the United States as an example. Do you think that black moms and dads have to educate their black children about racism? Yeah, they do, right? So those children have to be taught about racism. They have to be taught about why people say the things that they might say or do the things that they do. They might have to be taught how to keep themselves safe. They might have to be told They might have to be taught specifically how to deal with the police. And I'm not making this up. There are classes in schools, teachers will actually say, if a member of the police approaches you, here is what you say and here is what you do, right? You keep your hands where you can see them and you say, "Officer, I'm not doing anything. I will comply with any orders you give," right? So people, and particularly young Black Americans, are taught how to interact with the police so that they don't get shot or beaten, right? Do you think white children get that same training? No, they don't, right? Why don't they get that same training? Because apparently they don't need it, right? And so, again, people who are in minoritized groups, people who don't have privilege, have to educate themselves about how to deal with the dominant group. Dominant group members don't have to do the opposite. Dominant group members don't have to educate themselves about how to interact with the minoritized group. Okay. Anything else you want to say about this? Things that kind of jumped out at you, or privileges that you have or might have or think you don't have, or things you're confused about? No? Okay, that's all right. Okay, so let me say a couple more things here and introduce a few more things to you. So privilege operates on all kinds of levels, right? On societal levels, on interpersonal levels, within institutions. And again, it gives favors or advantages or benefits to members of dominant groups at the expense of members of minoritized groups, okay? And so there's three kind of broad areas of privilege that we'll talk about. And I'm not going to talk about all of these now because the first two here will become, there's a better example that I'll show you a little bit later this week and maybe next week. So I'm just going to say them now and then I'll come back to them because they'll make more sense in the context of something later. But privilege does have these dimensions. And one is the integration of dominant group norms into the structures of society. And so what I mean here is that society is kind of organized and constructed in a way, maybe I will give you an example here. It's organized in a way that benefits the dominant group, okay? So here's the example I'll give you for this. Here's the example I'll give you for this. All of you came to, well, if you're online, you didn't come to school, but think about the last time you went somewhere. But all of you in the room here, you came to school this morning, right? And some of you who just walked? Just walked? Nobody? Okay, just walked over here? Okay. Who took SkyTrain? Oh, okay. Obviously, well, I guess obviously everyone walked unless you have people to carry you, probably on like a litter, like a Roman emperor or something. So all of you clearly walked. SkyTrain, let's see the hands again. SkyTrain, bus, anybody on a bus this morning? Okay, anyone take the stairs this morning? Yeah, you all did because you can't use the elevator, right? So all of you got here using some combination of walking, SkyTrain, bus, you went upstairs, you went downstairs, you went off curbs, you probably crossed streets. How many of you opened the door and closed the door to your house? Probably all of you, right? Now, you didn't think anything of those things because you probably were texting or you were listening to music or you were thinking about, this movie or television show that you watched, or you're worried about your class or your exam or whatever. All of you had all kinds of things going on in your head, and you didn't think about any of those things that I just mentioned. But that's because you're all members of a dominant group in that you are all able-bodied, right? All of you, you can walk around on 2 feet. All of our hands work as far as I am aware. All of us can see with our eyes, although some of us wear glasses sometimes, but you can see and you can hear, right? All of us are in kind of an able-bodied dominant group. And the world, for the most part, is constructed for us, right? And so if your hands don't work, are you opening that door to come out of your house? No, right? That's a barrier. That's an obstacle that somehow you have to get around, right? If you're in a wheelchair, are you going down or up the stairs? No, you are not, right? If you have to go off the curb in your wheelchair, can you just go off a curb that has a... No, you need that curb cut, right? You need that little ramped down area. Again, if you're going to get on the SkyTrain in your wheelchair, are you just going to go up the stairs? No, you need the elevator, right? So there's all kinds of barriers, potential barriers. There's all kinds of potential barriers, George and Chan, that exist that most of us don't even notice. They're invisible because for the most part the world is built for us. It's built for people who can walk and whose hands work and who can see and hear. And granted, we've made some accommodations for people who cannot see or hear or who use a wheelchair, right? There's accommodations for those people. But the world is built for us. And so we move through that world with relative ease, right? With such ease, in fact, that we don't even think about it. You don't even think of all of those potential barriers that you encountered because you just walked up or down the stairs, or you just, looked both ways and crossed the street, or you just stepped off the curb wherever you felt like it because there were no barriers for you, right? And so that is privilege. That's able-bodied privilege that not everyone enjoys, right? All of you got dressed this morning, I see, but depending on your level of ability or disability, that might be a challenge, right? You might need some help with that. The second one is the construction of what's normal and not normal by the group. And so, again, the dominant group will kind of say what things are, they'll get to say what things are normal, what things are the default. And so we'll see this a little bit, or we talked about this a little bit with the resume situation, right? Where the resumes with the white sounding names didn't really get seen through any filters because there really aren't any strong stereotypes associated with white people, right? Because white people are seen as default, neutral, without culture, right? We're kind of seen as the norm. And I'm not saying, again, that that's right or that's true. I'm just saying that that's how we're seen, right? And so we have some, goofy stereotypes about us, like we like to wear khakis and we can't dance, and both of those things are reasonably true. But, sorry, white people. We have, and our food is not, has no spice on it. That's also true. But really, those are kind of silly little stereotypes and not necessarily very meaningful, right? And so we'll see this a few times in the future. I'll try to point it out. But dominant groups are seen as neutral, default, kind of without strong stereotypes attached to them, whereas people in minoritized groups are seen as different, the other, having culture or something like that, or there'll be stronger stereotypes associated with them. And again, I'm not saying that that's right, I'm just saying that that's how it often works. And the third one is the invisibility of privilege for the dominant group, okay? And I'm going to jump ahead. I'm in the wrong spot here. Hang on. I thought I was going to go in a different order, but I changed the order of my slides last night, and now I'm in the wrong place. Oops. Actually, okay, I'm in the right place. I'm going to come back to that invisibility thing because it's part of this here, okay? The other parts of privilege are ones that are internal or attitudinal, okay? So people in dominant groups often believe that they have a right to their position, right? And so whether you're talking about men or you're talking about dominant or white people or citizens of the country or whatever, people in the dominant group often believe they have a right to their position at the top, right? Did the plastics feel like they should be on top of the school hierarchy? Of course they did, right? They thought they were the coolest and the most beautiful and the most stylish, and everyone else was, nerds and losers and, poorly dressed and, unattractive. the plastics felt like they should be on top of the school hierarchy, and they were, right? Once upon a time, or maybe even still, did men feel like they should be in charge of the family and society as a whole?
Yes.
Yeah? Why did they think that?
Just they thought they were stronger, get more.
Say again?
They thought like they have like more power and they're just like stronger.
Right. So men thought, and maybe continue to think, that they are stronger, right? Women are, weaker or more frail, and so men should be in charge because men are stronger, right? What else was attached to that idea? Why else did men think that they should be in charge?
Give birth to the child, so they're associated with taking care of the family back home, so men assume that they have to work.
Right. So there's this biological reality, of course, that women are the only gender that can give birth to children, and because of that, men use that as a reason to say, well, women should be raising the children, they should be in the home, they should not be in the world of work, right? So the outside of the home, the world of work, that belonged to the men, and inside the home with the children, that was the place for women, right? So women were kind of excluded from the public sphere because of this sort of biological justification, right? But men felt that they should be in charge outside of the home because women belonged, quote unquote, inside the home. What else? Why else did men think they should be in charge?
Maybe some men think they're better.
In what way?
That women can't do
General.
tasks and hard jobs.
Hmm.
They're not able to.
Define hard.
Like some jobs that are like they're associated with men.
Hmm.
Yeah, they thought that they can't handle those.
Right. So again, women have been seen as not only physically weaker, but also emotionally and intellectually weaker, right? And so when so men decided that, of course, all of these difficult jobs that required, jobs that were high pressure or required a lot of logical thought, like law and politics and all these kinds of things, those were men's jobs because women were too emotional, too illogical, too frail, too weak to deal with these difficult jobs, and that they would probably faint if they had to do them or something, right? Which is all ridiculous, but that was part of men's belief that they had a right to their position at the top of society because they were, better. They were stronger, they were more logical, they were more kind of resilient in the face of, they could make difficult choices and things like that. And I don't know, I think that's ridiculous, but those were the ideas circulating at the time, right? Yeah, there was an internalization of messages of your group's superiority. And so dominant groups often do feel like they are superior to the minoritized group. Did men think that they were better than women?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they did. And in some cases, they still do. A lack of humility that results from your limited knowledge of the minoritized group. We can very much see this. Oh gosh, where can we see this? I don't know. Is an example of this coming to mind for anyone? A lack of humility. So the fact that if you're in the dominant group and you don't know much about the minoritized group, that doesn't bother or embarrass you.
Is it number 3?
That's number 3. No? I'm trying to come up with a good example of that, and there's not one on the tip of my tongue. So I'm going to leave it for now. Is that a noun, a verb, a statement, a question, a rationale?
People are very willing to start arguments even though they don't know anything.
It's true. People are willing to start arguments even though they don't know anything. Actually, I I think that gave me an idea. I think you're right. But do Americans seem very well informed about things that are countries outside of their own?
No,
No.
they know nothing.
They know nothing, right? They think Africa is a country, right? They think that, you know, yeah, they have a very kind of limited knowledge in general. Sorry, Americans, I know this is a bit of a stereotype too. But Americans are very focused on themselves, right? And their own history and events. And they think that everyone else is too. And they focus on themselves at the expense of everyone else, right? I forget who said it. There's a popular quote that, I forget who said it, it was decades ago. They said, Americans don't even know what street Canada is on. And yeah, because they don't. They don't know where we are. They don't know what goes on up here. They don't know, they think we all ride like polar bears to work in the snow or something like that. You know, and again, this is a bit of a stereotype that I'm playing into, but it's true that Americans have a lot of knowledge about themselves. They don't have a lot of knowledge of other countries around the world, but they're not really embarrassed or bothered by that because they think they're the best. And so all those other places are like, whatever, who cares, right? And we've seen Donald Trump say some very reductive and ridiculous and offensive things about other countries, revealing his ignorance of those other countries, but it doesn't embarrass him that he doesn't know anything about them, right? He's fine with not knowing anything about them. And because that's, again, I think we could argue that America, in terms of global culture, is a dominant group, right? They have power globally, and so they think they're better than everyone else, and they may not know much about other countries, but that doesn't bother them. And again, I know that's a bit of a stereotype, but that's all.
When is the voting?
The voting for the US?
Right now.
November.
Yeah, people are submitting advance ballots now, but it's November 3rd?
Yeah,
November 3rd
November 10th is official.
is official election?
Yeah, like November 3rd is like they kept counting the ballot, but you know the ballot sometimes wrong, so like it's official in November.
Oh yeah, and that actually may take even longer than that. So we may not even know on November 10th what the result is. So yeah, we've got a good 6 weeks at least left of this circus, whatever they think is happening down there. We've got at least 6 weeks of it to go. Hopefully not more. But I think actually thanks for saying America, because I think that America is a good example of a dominant group that is very focused on themselves. They don't know a lot about minoritized groups, about other countries, and they're not really embarrassed by that fact because America's the best. That's all they care about. Again, I know it's a bit of a stereotype. And the last one is invisibility of privilege, okay? So, is this? Okay. Now, some of the ways we see these kind of things play out is through two things called internalized dominance and internalized oppression. And we've actually seen this already, but we didn't give it a fancy name yet, okay? So internalized dominance and oppression are kind of thoughts and behaviors that reflect the unequal relationship you have between the dominant and the minoritized group. So oppression occurs at the level of society, but then people will kind of act out those relationships in kind of interpersonal ways, okay? So let me give you an example of both of these before I give you more detail, because we've seen it already. Remember we read about the experiment with Jane Elliott's kids, the blue-eyed and the brown-eyed kids, and the brown-eyed kids were told that they were smarter and better behaved, and the blue-eyed kids were told they were not as smart and not as well behaved, and they started to act that way, right? So that's a perfect example of internalized dominance and internalized oppression, right? So the brown-eyed kids internalized those social messages that they were smarter and better behaved, and then they started to act it out, right? They started to act out those messages, and they started to perform better on tests. They started to behave better, and they started to discriminate against the kids with blue eyes, right? Because they were told that they were better, they were superior. They internalized those messages, and then they kind of acted them out, which is not entirely surprising, but the surprising part is that it also works the other way with internalized oppression. So the blue-eyed kids absorbed the messages that the brown-eyed kids were the smart ones and they were kind of not so much. And so they acted out those social messages as well. They acted out the fact that they were not as smart and not as well behaved, and they had to put up with the discrimination from the brown-eyed kids. So they began to act from a place of internalized oppression. They acted out the social messages that they were less, right? Which is weird. You wouldn't think that would happen, but sometimes it does.
Could it just encourage that, like, the teachers encourage the brown-eyed kids and discourage the other kids? Not, she didn't, like, or he didn't mean to encourage them, but they did get encouraged instead of, like, you know what I mean? Like, did they get encouraged, or did something?
Are you asking, did the teacher encourage them to behave in such a way?
Yeah.
Well, it depends on what you think, right? She told them that brown-eyed kids are smarter than blue-eyed kids, and then she just kind of left them to their own devices, right? So she reinforced the social message, but then they started acting in accordance with it. So did she encourage it? No, she didn't tell them how to act, but did she encourage it by reinforcing that stereotype? She did, right? She created the stereotype, and then these kids internalized it, and then they started acting it out, either as oppression with the brown-eyed kids, or with a dominance for the brown-eyed kids, or with oppression as the blue-eyed kids. And this can happen in greater society as well, right? So people who are in minoritized group can act out their dominance with people of minoritized groups, and they can do it intentionally, they can do it on purpose, or they can do it by accident. And lots of this stuff is by accident. And so that's why it's worth pointing out, because people can do it without really meaning to, okay? And a lot of these things are termed microaggressions. Have you ever heard that term before? What does micro mean?
Small.
Small. What does aggression mean? Aggression. What does it mean?
Anger.
Yeah, anger, or being kind of assertive, or pushy, or something like that. Yeah, so these little aggressive attacks that people can make, but interestingly sometimes without meaning it, and sometimes when meaning it, okay? So here's an example of a few microaggressions. And the problem with microaggressions is that A, often people don't do them on purpose, but B, there's often a message behind it that reinforces the oppression in society, whether it's racism or sexism or whatever, okay? So if someone is multiracial, okay, so if they have two different parents or parents of different races or cultures, people might ask them, what are you anyway? Have you ever heard anyone ask that of someone? Have you asked that of someone?
No, I haven't.
Okay. Yeah, sometimes that gets asked, right? What are you anyway? And so, again, this is a tricky one, because people might be just simply curious about what people's cultural or ethnic heritage might be, but depending on how and when it's asked and by who, what's the kind of message behind this question? What's really being asked?
Where are you from? Where are you specifically?
Where are you specifically from?
You don't have an identity, specific identity.
Yeah, or I can't tell. I can't tell what box you fit in, right? And so Barack Obama, you're a multiracial person, you have a black father and a white mother. What are you anyway? Tell me so I can put you in the box with black stereotypes or the box with white stereotypes. Tell me what you are so that I can tell who you are, right? So there's this kind of reductive questioning, right? This idea of, you know, I have some stereotypes about black people and white people. I don't know which to apply to you. What are you anyway? So that way I can judge you based on it, right? Telling an older, this is just kind of mean. Telling an older person, you know, oh, I bet you were beautiful when you were young, right? So what's the message behind that?
It's so old.
You're so old, but what else is the message behind that?
You're not anymore.
You're not attractive. And who is attractive? Old people or young people? Yeah, we attach beauty to youth, right? In most, I can't speak for all of your cultures, of course, but here in the West, usually beautiful is young, right? Old is not beautiful. And so here we're reinforcing the fact that you are old, you are not beautiful anymore. Only young people can be beautiful. And so I'm sure you were beautiful once, but now, not so much. Kind of mean, right? A bit of an ageist microaggression here. This one's a little more tricky. So when you're talking to someone, a person of color, and you're like, oh, I don't see you as black.
Isn't that making the black guy feel like it's a shame to be a black person?
Maybe, right? Why would someone say, I don't see you as black?
Because they think black is bad.
Right. So it might be this underlying message that to be a black person is somehow a bad thing. And so it's like, oh, don't worry, I don't see you that way. How do you think the black person would feel about that?
Offended.
What?
Offended.
Perhaps, yeah. That's an ugly thing to say, right? Is that, the stereotypes that are attached to you are negative, but it's okay. I don't see you as one of those, right? So again, it seems like a potentially nice thing to say, but the message underneath has these negative stereotypes and prejudice attached to it. And really, and also what's it saying? It's saying, I'm not the bad guy here, right? Oh, don't worry, I don't judge you that way, right? Because I'm a good person. So it's saying that as well. Is it saying anything else? Is there another message here?
Like he or she is saying that I don't accept black people.
Right. So it might be saying that I don't accept black people, but you're okay. You're the one that's all right. How are you supposed to feel about that? Right? The other thing that I might point out here is by saying this, by saying I don't see you as black, is it a different experience living in, let's say, the United States as a black person than a white person? Are they having the same experience? No. It's a different thing. It's a different experience to live in the United States as a black person rather than a white person, right? Those are different things. And so if I don't see you as black, what I'm saying is I don't acknowledge that difference. I don't acknowledge that your experience of society is different from mine, right? I don't see that you will have struggles that I don't have, because I don't see you that way. You're just a person to me. And so I don't see any barriers that you might experience as a member of that race or gender or sexuality or whatever, okay? So yeah, there's a lot of hidden messages in this very simple statement. None of them are good, right? None of them are good. And there's lots of them. So here, I'll have you look, just look at the microaggressions here in the center. Have you heard anyone say those to you, or have you said them to other people? Tell me which one you've heard before. Pretty much all of them? Yeah? Do any of them jump out at you? You speak good. Has someone said that to you? So many times? Okay, and how does that make you feel? So I just meet you, Avera, and you say something to me, and I'm like, wow, you speak good English. How did you feel about that?
Kind of shit, because it feels like the person automatically assumes that I can communicate in their language, or I don't know, it's just demeaning.
Yeah, it reinforces a racial stereotype, right? Someone sees that you're of Asian descent, they assume that, oh gosh, you probably don't speak English, and then they're surprised, of course, that you do, as if speaking English is some sort of major, you know, actually it is a majorly difficult thing because the language is a mess, and I apologize to all of you who have had to learn English as a second language because our language is terrible and nothing is spelled the way it sounds and there's weird grammar rules, and so I apologize for all of that. It's a screwy language. But yeah, that's the message, right? Is that, oh, I didn't think you could do this thing that you can, right? And of course, why would you not be able to, right? Is it listed here? It is, right? Oh yeah. So, and maybe the other message here is that you don't belong here, right? I assumed you weren't one of us because of how you appear, right? And it makes you feel crappy, right?
But the thing is, it's not even like from people who speak good English or I don't know. Some people are like, oh, do you speak English in your country? I don't know, it's weird.
It is weird, right? And but it's based on people's ignorance or incomplete understanding of either you or your ethnicity or race or the country that you come from, all of those things, right?
Like, it's not bad at the same time, it's just a preconceived assumption.
Yeah. Exactly, right? And none of us like to be judged by preconceived assumptions, right? None of us like to be, you know, none of us like to be made to feel less in any way, right? Whether you do or whether you don't speak English, right? What's another one that jumps out at you?
Where are you from?
Where are you from? Yeah, so why is that? So has somebody asked you or you've just heard it?
Yes, they asked.
Yeah. And so why did that annoy you or?
No, they were just because like anyone who asked me, all of them thought I was Spanish.
Oh,
I
okay.
just wanted, yeah.
Right. So people mistook your ethnicity or your country of origin, right? And yeah, this one is difficult too because people, especially in Vancouver, people often get asked, oh, where are you from? But what's the underlying message there?
You don't look like one of us.
You don't look like one of us. And what do one of us look like? Yeah, right? So the idea under that is that Canada is a white country, which is not a true statement, but Canada is a white country, and therefore, when I see a non-white person, the assumption is, oh, they must be from somewhere else. But of course, the truth is we're all from somewhere else, unless you are a First Nations person, in which case you are from here. But all of us are from somewhere else, right? My grandparents are from England and Ireland. And so there are Chinese people, there are Chinese Canadians, Japanese Canadians, South Asian or Indian Canadians whose families have been in Canada longer than mine. But my family is seen as, you know, belonging here, and they still may be asked, oh, where are you from? And the answer might be, well, my great-grandparents were from Japan, but all of my other relatives were born here in Canada, were Canadian, right? So again, it reinforces the idea that Canada is a white country, and to be non-white means you're from somewhere else. You're not one of us, right? Which I always struggle with this one because, you know, sometimes I am curious where people are from, and within this school, because everyone is from somewhere else, I feel fairly safe in asking where people are from because I know you all are not from here. But out in the world, I would be much more careful, right? I know all of you are international students, so it's kind of okay. I know you're from somewhere else, but outside of the school, you got to be a little more careful because someone who looks like Avera might be from Singapore. When did you come to Canada? A couple years ago? Or a long?
Technically, like 3 weeks.
What's that?
I was only here for the semester I took history.
Oh, okay. So you had just arrived in Canada before that term? Okay, so you've been in Canada a year and a half or something, give or take?
Maybe half a year.
Is that all it was? Oh my gosh, time flies. Coronavirus time, right? So someone who looks like Avera, of course, you know, you've only been here for half a year, but someone who looks exactly like you could have been born here, and your parents could have been born here, and your parents' parents could have been born here, right? So the way you look says nothing about your nationality, right? Whether you belong here or not, but people may assume that, right? What about, here's a couple more. Anything jump out at you here?
It's not clear, but someone called me a chink.
Right. So that I'm not going to repeat that because I don't need that. I don't need video on the internet of me saying that word. That's not a good. It's not going to be a good thing for me. Yeah. So that's a racial slur directed at Chinese people, right? That's a racial slur for Chinese people. Are you Chinese?
No.
Yeah. So they didn't even use it right. Number one, and number two, yeah, it's an offensive thing to say, right? It's a racial slur. So that's not even a microaggression. I think that's a full-on aggression right there. And again, they didn't even.
It was random. I was looking at Skype and
Yeah, that's not cool.
This reminds me of something. There's a guy in my old high school called me a sand N-word.
Oh yeah, that's a bad one. That's not a microaggression though. That's a racist statement, right? So that's another one. But that doesn't make you feel really good either, does it? No, awful. I'll admit to one of these. I used to use this as a bit of a defense. The first one here, like I'm not a racist person because I have multiracial friends, right? So now, of course, I work in a college with lots of different races and ethnicities. When I was growing up, I lived in two houses. The first house I lived in when I first started going to school, my best friend was brown. So his dad was from Pakistan, his mom was from Philippines. And so he is my best friend. His name was Edward. Hi, Edward, if you're watching. I haven't seen you in 40 years or whatever, but yeah, but he was my best friend when I was a kid. And at the time, I didn't think anything of his skin color. And so obviously I knew it was different from mine, but I never thought about it. It never meant anything to me. We were just friends, right? And similarly, when I was in middle school, when I was in junior high, my best friend, his name was Travis. Hey, Travis, if you're watching. Travis's parents, he was black. Travis's parents were from Guyana in South America. And so, again, I obviously knew he was black. There was a difference, but it didn't really mean anything significant to me. And so I always assumed that, oh, well, you know, I've been around people of different races and they've been my friends, and so I cannot be racist in any way. And again, I've come to learn that that's not entirely true. I can still have racist thoughts and act in racist ways, even though I had friends of different races growing up, right? But I've used that one, right? I've said that. I've said that before. And again, it's a nice sentiment. It's a nice thing to want to believe, but it's a bit of an oversimplification. It's not entirely true, right? I can still hold racial thoughts, even subconsciously, even though consciously speaking, I have no issue, right? Those guys are my friends. I didn't think anything of their race or ethnicity. We just hung out and rode our bikes and played hockey and played video games and things like that, right? Anything else jump out here at you that you've said or have had said to you or you've heard people say? Has anyone, in the last box there, has anyone said anything or has anyone heard anything like people criticizing other people's cultures as being too loud or too quiet or too this or too that? Yeah? The first one, what is it? Why do you have to be so loud?
So many times. I mean, I might be loud.
Well, this is interesting, right? But let's say you are loud, but if we're both loud, I'm not, but if we were both loud, you and I, might someone assume that your loudness has to do with your culture and my loudness just has to do with just me? Might someone assume, Salah, where are you from?
Syria.
You're from Syria? Okay. So might someone assume that if I was really loud, they might say, oh, Mike's a really loud guy, like just tone it down a little bit. But if Salah's a loud guy, might people think, oh, Syrians must be loud? Yeah, exactly. So because of, in Canada here, not in Syria, but in Canada, because you're in a minoritized group, people are more likely to attribute a personal characteristic you have to your race or ethnicity. With me, they're much less likely to do so. So if I'm loud, people are much less likely to say, oh, white people are sure loud, ugh, right? But people are much more likely to say when they encounter Salah, oh, Syrians must be really loud. And are they? Not so much?
Really,
Not so much?
not so much.
So again, that might be a stereotype too. But yeah, so people might be more likely to attribute a personal characteristic to your social group. And what's also in here is that it's a bit of a judgment, right? You're too loud, right? Your culture is too loud. Your culture is too this, too that. And what are we comparing it to? Western culture, right? Because Western culture is obviously perfect. Big eye roll. Western culture is obviously perfect, and so the judgment is you're too loud because you're different from Western culture, right? So that message is kind of underlying that as well, right? So you're being judged against the meter stick of Western culture, which is apparently the ideal. Big eye roll, right? Okay, let's take a little break, and then when we come back, I'll figure out what we're going to do. Take 10. Okay, so here we go. We are back. Sorry we had a bit of a longer break than I thought, but I'm sure that's okay sometimes. Right, so we said that sometimes privilege is kind of acted out in terms of internalized dominance and internalized oppression, right? So with internalized dominance, people are acting out messages of their group superiority on their own, right? And so I said sometimes these are kind of a little more on the intentional side. Sometimes they are unintentional, right? And so, and sometimes it's difficult to know, right? And so someone who asks you where you're from might be honestly curious. It's like, oh, okay, where are you from? I'm curious. I'm interested to learn and know, right? So it can be a very innocent thing, but it can also be, it can also be transmitting messages of, oh, you don't belong here, so where are you from, right? And it can be really difficult to figure out the difference between them. And that's what makes microaggressions kind of draining, right, John and George? That's what makes microaggressions really kind of draining and difficult, is because sometimes it's not clear, right? If somebody calls you a racial slur, it's pretty clear what that is, right? You don't have to interpret what they mean. It's a pretty clear, in-your-face, rude thing. But with microaggressions, sometimes it's not entirely clear whether, somebody is trying to, act out their internalized dominance, or, if they just don't realize what they're saying, or maybe they're just kind of genuinely curious, right? And so here in the college sometimes, even though I'm hesitant to ask, yeah, sometimes I'm curious about which country you're from. That's of interest to me, right? But I'm not trying to say you don't belong here, because you most certainly do. But sometimes I'm just curious. But again, it can be difficult to determine what's happening. And that's what makes microaggressions difficult to deal with, because people have to ask themselves, what was meant by that statement? And should I be offended, right?
But if you make a comment,
Yes.
in microaggression unintentionally, would that still be?
Well, and this is the thing, and maybe we'll get to this a little bit later, but maybe I'll say it now as well, is that this is why I kind of go so far as to talk about socialization and kind of absorbing social messages without knowing it, and sometimes acting them out, like Katie and Regina, and the fact that microaggressions can be unintentional too, because we all have to kind of accept the fact that we might say something or do something that can hurt other people, right? I have to acknowledge that even though I would put myself in the category of not a racist person, I also have to be aware of the fact that I could say something or act in a way that someone might perceive as racist, right? I have to be ready for that. And I have to be kind of secure enough to acknowledge that I might say something or do something wrong, and I might have to be ready for that, and I might have to apologize and say, oh gosh, I wasn't really implying that. I didn't really mean to say what you thought I said, but I can see how you would interpret it that way. And so this is why I try to push the unintentionality, because it allows people to be less defensive, right? If I come in and say, anyone who says anything racist is a horrible, awful person, well, then it's hard to have a conversation when you slip up and you might say something that hurts someone in sort of a racist way, right? It's impossible to have the conversation because suddenly you're on the defensive, right? You're like, oh gosh, I must be a horrible, awful person now. And you might be, but it's also might just be an unintentional thing, right? And it might be a misunderstanding, or it might be something that has to do with the context around you, right? And so we have to be kind of comfortable acknowledging that, yeah, sometimes we might act in ways that are discriminatory, or we might say something that hurts someone, and we have to be able to have a conversation about it. And so again, that's why I push this sort of, you can have a microaggression thing by accident, right? And it doesn't mean that it doesn't hurt, and it doesn't mean that it doesn't bother people, but you just have to be ready for the fact that you could say something and you might have to apologize for it, and it doesn't make you a horrible, awful person. It just makes you a person who has been socialized. And as part of that socialization, you pick up, negative stereotypes and certain biases, and sometimes you act them out without realizing, right? Yeah, that's kind of what I'm going for. Okay. Oh boy, there's a lot of those. We don't have to look at all of them. Internalized oppression. So, like I said, with the blue-eyed kids in Jane Elliott's class, this is where people start to act out messages that their group might be inferior to the dominant group. And so again, this is a little weird and a little counterintuitive, right? You would think that people in minoritized groups would not act out messages that, put them at a disadvantage. But as it turns out, sometimes that's exactly what happens. And with the blue-eyed kids, they did it, right? They started performing more poorly. That was not in their best interest to do so. The stereotype about them being not as smart was not almost certainly, it was certainly wrong. There was no truth to it, but they started acting that way anyway. And so sometimes we see people acting out their oppression in a few different ways, right? So sometimes people might not point out microaggressions when they happen to them, right? You might not feel safe in doing so, right? Somebody might call you, if somebody might actually call you an offensive name, right? A racial slur, and you might not feel comfortable standing up and say, hey, jerk, don't call me that, or something a little more forceful. But you might not feel comfortable because you might not feel that anyone else would support you, right? Anyone around you. I won't maybe read all of these kind of point by point, but sometimes people can act or believe these things as part of a minoritized group because of how they have been socialized. Because when you're in a society, whether you're in the dominant group or the minoritized group, you all absorb the same social messages, right? So if an underlying message is that, that men are superior to women, right? Women absorb that message just like men do, right? And so men will act it out and act in ways that are superior, but women will also act in ways that sort of confirm their inferiority, right? So we said that for a long time in, many countries around the world, but in Canada, women weren't allowed to vote and weren't allowed to run for political office or participate in the political sphere at all. And most men believed that that's because women weren't suited for it. They were too emotional, they weren't logical, they weren't up to the rigors of political debate. They didn't feel that they were ready for that. But lots of women felt that way too, interestingly. Lots of women felt, oh no, that's man's work. That's, all that logic, and that's, men should handle that. And, if I want my political views heard, I'll just tell my husband, right? And so nowadays we're kind of like, oh my God. But lots of women felt that way. Lots of women didn't feel that way. But again, they absorbed the same social messages that men did. And so I think I have some slides on this later, but in Canada, when women were advocating and fighting for the right to vote, women had to convince men that they should be able to vote, but those women actually had to convince other women as well, because some women felt, no, politics isn't the place for women. I'll just tell my husband what I think and he'll vote for me, right? So many women didn't see that they were being oppressed. Many women didn't see this as a social inequality. They thought it was fine because, again, they had absorbed the same social messages that men had. And so women fighting for the right to vote had to convince men, but also had to overcome this internalized oppression. They had to convince women too that you should care about this, women, and we should have the right to vote too. And again, you wouldn't think that, but that was the case, right? So, oh my gosh, there's all kinds of different ways in which people can act out internalized oppression. Those are on the right here. I can't talk about too many of them because, again, I'm not in a lot of minoritized groups, and so I don't have direct experience with a lot of these. But can I ask, do any of these kind of jump out to you as things that you've seen or felt or experienced or heard from other people? Do any of them? I know there's a lot of them there. Just look in the right column. Don't worry about the left one.
Can you zoom in?
Can I zoom in? No, I can't. That's one of the things I cannot do with this, I don't think. Can I? No, I can't. Anyway, there's a lot of them. There's a lot of ways in which people can act out these social messages. And again, they not only disadvantage people when they act them out, but it also confirms the stereotype, right? If people, in Jane Elliott's class, the stereotype was that blue-eyed kids were not as intelligent, and then they started to act it out, and then it actually looked like the stereotype was true. It actually looked like blue-eyed kids were not as smart, because look at the test scores. They don't score as well. But again, the stereotype influences people's behaviors, but it's not based in truth. It just looks true, right? And so, yeah, it just looks true. Oh yeah, okay, and the last thing I'll say here before we're done is that privilege is characteristically invisible to people who have it, okay? And so the reason for this is that some of the privileges that we've talked about are things that everybody should have, right? So again, when I go into a store, people don't follow me around thinking I'm going to steal things, right? And that's really the way it should be with everyone, right? When I move into an apartment building, I don't worry that my race is going to work against me. I don't worry that people are not going to be nice to me because I'm white. And that's how it should be for everyone. Everyone should be able to move into an apartment building and not have people judge them by their race or ethnicity, right? So some of these privileges are things that everybody should be able to enjoy, right? The other thing is that some people with privilege assume that if only people worked harder, they would actually have those privileges as well. And again, that's not true either. The reason for this, and I'm going to speed through this just because we've only got a few minutes left, is that in some ways privilege, you can think of privilege like a fish in water, okay? And so if the fish is swimming with the current, so if the river is going that way and the fish is swimming in that direction, the fish doesn't really feel the current, right? It doesn't feel the water moving. It's just moving along, swimming, and everything seems fine. The only way you feel the current is if the fish is going the other way. If the fish is fighting the current, it's got to swim a lot harder to get where it's going. And that's what privilege is. If you don't have it, it's a lot harder to work your way through society. And if you do have it, you don't really notice that it's gently pushing you along. And so, again, it's easy to deny that privilege exists if you're in the dominant group because you don't feel it, right? I'm a white male Canadian English speaker in Canada. Has that benefited me? It probably has. When? I couldn't tell you. I don't know for sure, because you don't feel it benefiting you. But if you are a person of color, if you're someone maybe who is a recent immigrant, or you don't speak English very well, if you wear clothing that indicates your religion, so if you're wearing hijab or burqa or niqab or turban, if you're wearing these things that signify you as part of a different religion or as a kind of an outsider, then you will feel that discrimination, right? You'll feel people treating you a little bit differently in a way that I will not feel. So some people will feel the current. So it's very easy to feel when you don't have privilege, but when you have privilege, you don't feel it at all. It just feels like this is just the way things are, right? You don't notice that there's a current moving you along. And that's why it's so easy to deny that privilege exists, and that's why it's invisible, because often you don't feel it, right? You don't realize that you have it because it's invisible. You don't feel it pushing you along the way that it does. Okay, so that's all I'll say for today. Tomorrow I will return your quizzes, and I'll try to, I think I'll assign that, that paper to you so that you can get going on it. Sorry, but I gotta do it sometime. There's never a good time, right? Is there ever a good time? No. I guess it depends when it's due, right? Friday. I'm teasing. No, I'm joking. I'm totally joking. So I'll do that tomorrow. Online people, thank you for being here and participating. I will see you tomorrow, so I'm going to sign off with you, so goodbye.